Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name's Greg Mank. My new book about the lifestyles of the dead and famous is going to be sold in the back by my lovely wife, Barbara. We will take organ donations or anything else you have for forms of payment. We're going to be talking about the 1931 film M, and screening M. I think if you have not, how many people have not seen M before? Okay, good. Now, how many people have not seen M, say, in the last 5 years? Okay, good, good. If you've not seen M, or if you've not seen it recently, I think you're in for a pleasant surprise. Thanks, I think I've got this, but I'll keep this. Yeah, how do we turn this off?
Twist it the other way. Twist it.
Okay, good.
Greg, Max
I'll keep
can be an
this
extra
together.
light.
You stir her up or
Now, we're not going to be starting this evening with the 1931 film M. Instead, we're going to be starting with a 1963 film called Léopris. We know it in English as simply Contempt. In this film, Brigitte Bardot played a French actress named Camille, and Fritz Lang played a German director named Fritz Lang. There was a scene in there where she comes up to him and says, "Oh, Mr. Lang, I just love your work. I really love Metropolis." And he said, curious. I've always preferred M. Well, you know, I've thought about that a lot, and it's really what first inspired me to want to do this. This one scene. By the way, the movie is terrible. If anybody gets a chance to see it, it's awful. The guy who produced it, Joseph Lucy, hated the movie so much. He had this rather extensive nude scene with Brigitte Bardot in the beginning. He said he wanted to have at least one thing in the film he would like. Everything else he loathed. It's really not much of a film. It's Jean-Luc Godard is the director, and it's not one of Godard's all-time best. But I've thought about this a lot. This film came out in 1931, and of course there were a couple of other prominent films in our field that came out in 1931. The Universal Frankenstein, Universal Dracula. And I know some people feel as though, well, they're kind of old, they're sort of creaky. I personally don't. Those films work really well for me. But shot for shot, film compared to film, I've got to say, of the three great films of 1931, in my estimation, Dracula, Frankenstein, and M, I think probably I like M a little bit better than the other two. And I love the other two. But there is something about this film. I hope that you agree with me when you get a chance to see it tonight. Tonight we are going to be looking at the story of M and what inspired it, how it came to be made, the new ground that it broke, the reactions to it, the consequences of its release, and finally some questions I'd like you to keep in mind as you view it. We'll be discussing those questions after the film. So, first we're going to be discussing M's roots. And if you're looking at the roots of the movie M, the first place you've got to stop is to follow this lovely young man right there. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a pandemic in Germany. The pandemic was of serial murder. I think you can probably conclude that your society is not doing particularly well if you've got that as your main problem in your society. They were having some very difficult times, and this man was one of the more notorious of them. His name was George Karl Grossman, 1863 until his suicide in 1922, just as the police were closing on him. Grossman, we're never quite sure exactly how many people Grossman killed. We think he killed up to about 50 women, most of them either prostitutes or destitute women. He covered up his crimes by selling their flesh in tins of black market canned meat. He also had a hot dog stand. And he always had a steady supply of material for his wieners as long as the murders continued. Now, I mentioned George Grossman because Grossman is mentioned in this film. They will be mentioning Grossman in this film later. He's one of the cases that, one of those very high-profile serial killer cases that helped to inspire this film. Our next stop is this rather timid-looking little man. I think, to quote Norman Bates, a man who looks like he wouldn't hurt a fly. His name was, there we go, Fritz Hartmann, and his He was known as the Vampire of Hanover. Now, Hartman was also a multiple killer. During his time, he killed, there we go, get back to that, back to that. He killed up to 27 young men. Now, Jack the Ripper killed 5, keep in mind now. His 5 murders were awful, but he killed 5 people. The way that he would work, he'd pick up, could be anywhere from teenage boys to young men. He would bring them back to his place, and usually as he was sodomizing them, he would lunge forward and bite out their throats. He also, he would dispose of the bones in the river, and he picked Grossman's way of disposing of bodies. He sold the meat as canned pork on the black market. One of the reasons I bring Hartman up is because he is also mentioned in this film. This is a memorial to his victims. Often after I had killed, I pleaded to be put away in a military asylum, but not in a madhouse. Oh, believe me, I am not ill. It's only that I occasionally have funny turns. I know that it fixes the film all that funny. But here you begin to see some of the things that were influencing Thea von Harbo and Fritz Lang when they made this film. Here, the monster is the victim in his world. And you'll see that repeated a bit in the film. Now, our last stop of our serial killers is this man. Again, he looks very, very timid. He did not sell his victims as canned meat, thank God. His name is Peter Curtin. 1883 until his execution in 1931. During that time, he was known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Peter Curtin blazed quite a trail. Now, there was a very intimate connection between this film and the character Peter Lorre plays and this man, although Fritz Lang, through his life, denied it. Now, we do have a problem with Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang was very, very unreliable. He often, and we don't understand why, but he would often lie. Fritz Lang would say things that we just simply know are not true. And film historians have been tearing their hair out trying to understand fact from fiction in the world of Fritz Lang. Now, Curtin, we'll get into his crimes in just a moment. Curtin said, "Never have I felt any misgivings in my soul, never did I think to myself that what I did was bad. Even though human society condemns it, my victims will be on the heads of my torturers. The punishments I have suffered have destroyed all my feelings as a human being. That was why I had no pity for my victims." So again, we have the perpetrator, the villain, as the victim. During his reign of terror, and it was quite a reign of terror, there he is again. He attacked 41 people, 9 of them died. So he didn't murder every single one of them. Some he just horribly named.
He's only been like 230.
He was dubbed the Vampire of Dusseldorf because he drank the blood of some of his victims. Now, in the search to try to find who was doing this, there were over 12,000 leads that were followed. Over 200 people surrendered themselves claiming to be the killer. 300 psychics and occultists offered their help. The 2 letters Curtin sent to the local newspaper sparked a flood of copycats. The public was in a state of mass psychosis. Police asked the underworld for help. He was arrested on May 24th, 1930, and he was executed July 2nd, 1931 in Cologne. Now, these are 2 very important dates, because after May 24th, 1930, Fritz Lang and Theo Harbo came up with the idea for the movie M. He was executed, actually, after the movie premiered the following May in 1931. Now, all through his life, Fritz Lang always denied there was any connection between Peter Curtin and the character you'll be seeing in M. But you're going to be seeing that some of these things are going to be eerily repeated in the film. Now, how M came to be filmed. This is Fritz Lang, a young Fritz Lang, and this is a young Thea von Harbo. They met about the year 1920, they married in 1921, and they became quite a team. They worked on several very high-end films together. But they ran into some problems. they had been responsible for Metropolis and Woman in the Moon. Has anybody here ever seen Woman in the Moon?
No.
Not one of my particular favorites. But they were both very expensive, very large budget films, and neither of them did particularly well at the box office. And so when the sound era came in, Fritz Lang was actually thinking about retiring from directing altogether. There he is in his salon with his wife, Thea von Harbo. The story goes that he had grown completely disenchanted with film. He was thinking about getting into some other form of the arts. One, a very wealthy benefactor, we don't know his name, but an admirer of Fritz Lang's persuaded him to make one more film. And eventually he agreed to it with this guy's backing, provided he had final cut and no interference. And he agreed. And so they went about trying to put this film together. Now, during that time, even though he claimed there was absolutely no connection between his film and this man, Peter Curtin, we know the article in the issue, and about the time that Fritz Lang read, it was an article about Peter Curtin. From that point, we know that they researched the crime story carefully. We know that Fritz Lang went to all the murder scenes that we knew about from Curtin. We know that he interviewed sex offenders in prison. We know that he spent 8 days doing field research in an insane asylum. We know that he talked extensively to the police in Berlin. He also went to Scotland Yard and talked to the police detectives there. But yet he claims there was absolutely no connection. I find that rather hard to believe. Now, he knew that he wanted to have Peter Lorre in the film. He knew that he wanted to have Peter Lorre be somebody who had done something terrible. But he was going to make him at first somebody who sent out poison pen letters and was a blackmailer. Well, as the Curtin case became more and more prominent, I think his ideas on that began to change. So when he first came up with the film, he had the working title of Murderers Among Us. He was having some trouble with that, though. There was a problem with that. It seemed as though every single thing he tried to do to make this film in its early days, when this was his working title, was thwarted. He couldn't rent costumes, he couldn't get a cast, he couldn't get sets. Every door was closed to him. He could not understand why. Until one day, when he was having an argument with a guy who did the sets, he noticed the man had his jacket like this. He noticed on the other side of his lapel a swastika. That's when he began to put a few things together. There was a very high-profile trial that had recently happened. And in that trial, there were a couple of members of Hitler's SA that had been convicted of having tracked down and murdered a communist who was working against the Nazis. Now, Hitler always said that he was innocent. He had absolutely nothing to do with that. As it turns out, the SA members who were convicted ended up getting very, very light sentences. It was rather controversial. And so the Nazis thought this title was about them. Now, say what you like about the Democrats, the Republicans, the Tea Party, the Occupy Wall Street people. Generally, any of our parties here in this country usually don't think that a title like Murderers Among Us must be about us just from reading the title. But the Nazis were a very dark presence. I don't think you need me to tell you that. So the movie was finally off and running. It was filmed over the course of 6 weeks. It opened in Berlin on May 11th, 1931. And it was a hit. It really convinced Fritz Lang to stay in the movie business. There were several firsts about this film. We're going to be taking a look at them now. It was Fritz Lang's first sound film. Now, about a third of this film was actually shot silently. At the time, sound was just coming in, sound equipment was very expensive, and so Fritz Lang economized by doing some silent portions in it. Now, in the 1960s, this movie began to find its legs again, and they began to re-release it. It had been banned for a long time. And to try to get through that silent part, some people were putting music, sometimes there would be dialogue injected in those scenes. It drove Fritz Lang crazy. He said he actually wanted the silence. He said he thought the silence was far more eerie than if he would put sound in.